Hi, everyone. Happy August 1st. Happy Monday. I hope you're all having a fantastic day. Today, we're here to talk to Ken Meter, and he's going to tell us all about food systems and probably his awesome book, Building Community Food Webs. So excited to have you. This is great. I'm going to let Guillermo then introduce himself. Go for it, Guillermo.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erin. Hello, everyone. I'm Guillermo Ortiz. I'm the Sustainability and Diversity Educational Programs Manager here at UC Merced's Office of Sustainability. Erin and I set up the AMA series just to hear from different perspectives and experts within the realm of sustainability. And with that, I want to say thank you to Ken for joining us and sharing his expertise. Ken, I'm going to turn it over to you and feel free to introduce yourself.
Okay, great. Well, I'm calling in from Minneapolis, as I said, and my pronouns are he and him. I'm really happy to be speaking to you at a time when this book has come out, and also a time when I've had a chance to reflect during the pandemic on the last 20 years or so of my professional work around the country. I've had a chance. I see some familiar names on the participants list, and that's really encouraging to see some people I know already. But I've had a chance to work in 144 regions in 41 states so far. And that's all been spreading by word of mouth as people have brought me into one community and the word has spread to other places to bring me in. The centerpiece of my work is to take a look at how the farm and food economy of each region works and how it doesn't work, to really get a grounding in what's going well, what's failing, what are some of the unique assets of each community. And I've been able, from that starting point, to write strategic plans, business plans, feasibility analyses, and a lot of other spin-off work from that. I don't think there are more than 4 or 5 people around the country who have as much experience working in different communities as I have. And the book gave me a chance to pull all that together into one place and say, here's some of my favorite stories about people working together across a lot of the silos, across a lot of their disciplinary lines, across a lot of the political fragmentation we've been experiencing, to try to really make healthier food systems a reality in all these places. So that's hopefully the book has both my analysis of how the food economy has been extracting wealth, especially from rural America, but even from inner city areas as well. And I have quite a bit of experience prior to this in working in inner city areas in Minneapolis. And the book also has 8 case studies of particularly exciting work that's been done in states as diverse as Montana, Hawaii, Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Ohio, and probably a couple others I forgot to mention. But I think they're really, in my mind, some of the best stories, not all ones that I was involved with. Some of them do tell stories of how I really turned the discussion in a better way, but they're all efforts to kind of say, here's how people can collaborate most effectively to make the best food systems possible happen around the country. And I look forward to your questions from that.
All right, so if you have a question, feel free and either put it in the chat, or you can raise a hand or just unmute, whatever you prefer. Sarah, you are unmuted. So do you have a question potentially for Ken? Perhaps not. Awesome. I do have a question. So you in your book talk about 4 pillars, which are health, wealth, connection, and capacity. Why those 4? Were there other ones that you were leaning towards including, but why those 4?
Well, those 4 really come out of about 40 years of reflecting on my work, both in low-income neighborhoods of Minneapolis and also working with the food systems work. I think, first of all, I'd say that a lot of our discussions when I got started really focused almost entirely on who's making money. It was as if we solved the financial question for people, then the food system would fall into place automatically. And that's clearly not true. We see a lot of people making pretty good money in the food system at the expense of other folks in the food system. And part of my research has been to really try to show how some folks really prey off the food system to make more profit while other folks are at a disadvantage. And that leads me to kind of think about the fact that food systems are very complex. They're changing very rapidly, even as we try to intervene. So, I take a measurement of food system, and by the time I get the report written, things have changed already. And we have to kind of understand those changing forces and the tensions that are existing there. And part of my effort was to say, let's have a more complex measure of success than just who's making money. So I talked about a 4-part way of looking at what a food system's purpose should be. First of all, I'd say a food system obviously needs to build health. And this is pretty obvious to most people. For all of us, eating the right foods is probably the best strategy we all have to stay out of the medical system and to have healthy bodies, healthy outcomes in our lives, to feel better, and to also to sort of support healthy practices on the planet. So I don't think it's a surprise if I talk about a food system building health, but often that was ignored in the conversations when we started doing this work. Now it's become much more apparent to people. I also talk about wealth, but I'm also aware in my analysis of the extractive economy that the food systems we have are drawing wealth out of rural Americas especially. And I argue that if a food system doesn't create wealth for farmers, who are really the primary producers in the food system, then it's not going to be sustainable for the farmers, and it won't be sustainable for the communities that depend on those farmers over the long haul. And probably everybody on this call has had experiences with a farmer who's gotten involved with very high hopes and very good intentions of serving local markets, and finding that is really quite difficult. So we have a lot of room, we have a lot of ways to go before we're going to have food systems that really reward farmers effectively. And my argument would be that that's not going to happen by market forces alone. It's going to happen because we make investments to make community food trade as efficient, if not more efficient, than the current system we're working with. So it's really a matter of our public policy, our public coordination, and the investments we make to really create the food system of the future. 2 other themes that you mentioned, Erin, that I really also think are very important to talk about. One is the need to connect around food. And the way I talk about that is that when I have my family over for a holiday, I'm often serving the foods that my mother served me during the holidays, which happened in my family happened to be the same foods that her grandmother served her on a wood stove, which happened to be the same foods that her grandmother served from a wood stove back in the old country in Bohemia. And in many ways, the way we connect around eating together, breaking bread together, keeping a recipe alive, keeping food traditions alive, is really important. That's how I place myself on the planet, to say, this is who I belong to. This is where I belong. And those traditions come out of places where people were serving what was easy to grow, what they could mill with their own hands. My family were millers and farmers and cabinet makers and woodworkers. And they could bring what they brought, what they could grow to the table to eat. And that's a real different sense of connection than simply going to the store and buying it and bringing home. Finally, though, we also need to build the capacity to handle food safely. I'm kind of shocked as I go around. I was just doing some interviews in Central Illinois last week, and this bore out a story I've heard in Alabama, and I've heard in many parts of the country, where many people, even professionals, don't even have pots or pans in their kitchen. They basically rely on a microwave. They rely on going out to eat. They may eat a quick sandwich that they don't have to cook. But we really have a country of people who can buy very beautiful foods that have a very long shelf life, but they really don't. We really don't know as a society much about where our food comes from. We don't know how it was grown. We don't know the practices behind that the farmer used. And we don't really have, many of us, the capacity to cook proper meals, to put a balanced diet together for ourselves, or to really know how to really preserve food in a safe way and effective way for future eating. So I would argue, unless we're basically accomplishing all 4 of those things, we have a failed food system. And, when I give a speech, I usually go through very quickly how we're failing on all 4 of those counts. So I would say, if we believe that's the purpose of a food system, then we have serious work to do to get a food system that we really deserve to have at the local level, which does build in our communities health, wealth, connection, and capacity. Underlying all of that, as I mentioned when I talked about connection, is the whole notion of culture. that really relates to all four of those, because health practices are cultural practices, and my family knew more about health than my family does, and my ancestors knew more about health than my family does. And we have lost a lot of our inherited knowledge, a lot of our indigenous knowledge, by the way that we've developed a food system that's based on buying things rather than producing them for ourselves. So that would be the four things that I think are kind of important to hold out there. You can find lots of other purposes, but I find that if you get more than four, it's hard to talk about it. It gets too complicated to discuss. And if you try to dumb it down too much, then you end up distorting your view of the system and not really having the outcomes you want to have.
Okay, I wanted to follow up with what you said about farmers with good intentions who are trying to then seek ways to serve their local food markets. What are some of the obstacles that you've commonly seen that kind of takes that good intention and then that hits reality, right? And then unfortunately, they kind of fall into patterns that are less than helpful in your eyes? Like, what are some of those obstacles that often pop up?
Well, there are really so many. I was just hearing a story last week about a farm in the Midwest that I've really treasured for being a very effective farm, one of the pioneers in organic farming, raising vegetables, really working with neighbors to collaborate. Really had some very robust markets to work with, and they finally decided it was just getting to be too much work. It was just not enough time off, not enough time to really nourish themselves, not enough time to think and study and to kind of improve their own lives in other ways. And that runs the gamut of, it's hard for some folks getting started to get adequate credit, either because they don't have a farming background and they can't qualify for a federal loan because they don't have 3 years of farming experience behind them, or they don't have neighbors who will loan them money. There are some wonderful stories about neighbors helping out a young farmer, but those are few and far between. It's also true, a lot of folks have ramped up production for a wholesale buyer, only to find out that the buyer was simply going to buy for about 6 months and then lower their price because they could find a competing source. So they just wanted to pay the minimum to get by. And there's a whole issue of, a lot of people talk about they really prefer local food, but when it comes right down to it, they go to restaurants that don't feature local foods. They go to restaurants and they say, what this farm is raising is more money than I want to spend. They're not really committed to the process of using their food expenditures to build a food system for themselves and their grandkids. They're sort of saying, well, it's trendy to say I like local food, so I'll say I like local food. So it's a process of engaging consumers to be what Carlo Petrini of Slow Food says, co-producers, where they understand that they have an investment to make in a relationship to production, and not simply people who are looking after really nice meals with high quality products. There's really, I could go on and on. I mean, there's so many obstacles. A lot of the very small farms have done really well connecting with customers, but they just find it's not quite enough business to pay for a family. A lot of folks coming out of college now have college debts to pay, and they have to pay those off before they can think about farming. I was reading a very poignant quote from a farmer in California last week who said, he went through a whole farmer training program and got trained how to farm very expertly, had a business plan. And he basically said, I think I can start farming when I retire and I have a pension to draw upon. And I think that's a real tragic moment to be in as a country, I think.
Oh, thank you, Ken. I appreciate the answer.
So, quick question. How many years of farming does it generally take to get a loan? You mentioned that they only have 3 years. They might not be able to get a loan. Is there like a limit, or is that just a general guideline?
How many years of farming to get to what stage?
In order to get a loan, you mentioned
a loan.
as far as how long.
Well, I mean, it's it really varies, but to get a federal loan, from the Farm Security Administration, you have to have 3 years of farming track record. You have to have records to show that you farmed, and they're basically saying we want you to prove it to us that you are experienced enough as a farmer that if we give you a loan, you can pay it back. Now, that doesn't happen everywhere, but that would be true for limited resource farmers. So you get in this crazy thing where you may start to farm and you either don't have the adequate records or you don't have 3 years experience behind you, and you need money, but you can't get it, even though you would qualify otherwise. I also have a wonderful story about a farmer who grew up in Virginia, and he was in the Shenandoah Valley, and he grew up there. He went away to college. He came back, and he decided he wanted to farm. And 6 of his neighbors came together and said, "We're going to each give you $10,000 as a gift because we want you in our community. We know that you're going to treat it well, and we know that you're going to belong in our community, but we're giving you money that you can use to get your farm started." That was enough to help him get his herd of cattle underway. Now, he had 20 years or more of farming experience working for his family, but it was all helping his family out, not really running his own business. But in that case, some neighbors have said, "We want you in the neighborhood." And that kind of story is very precious to have when it happens. I don't think there's a magic number about, I mean, there's some farms who do very well the first year. Obviously, one of the easier ways to start out is to do a CSA where you have people invest money up front to help you pay for seed and to help you get going on your farm. And then they share the risk of farming with you during the year. That's one of the easier ways for younger farmers or emerging farmers to get started, because they have a core of people who are giving them money up front to get started. But that's also a lot of work. And some folks who do that for a number of years say it's just too much work, and we want to either go back to wholesaling or they get into some other line of work altogether, unless they're really dedicated to keeping those customers happy. A lot of customers sign up for a CSA when they have a bad year, big sign up during the pandemic. And then they may drift away and say, I'd really rather, it's easier for me to go to the store. So there's all those kind of ins and outs that apply almost everywhere. And building a lasting system where people can really count on a good livelihood is a matter of public civic leadership, public policy, and really saying, we're going to contract with farmers in advance, somewhat like a CSA. We'll say, some food banks are doing this all over the country now. Some supermarkets are doing this. We'll say, if you grow 5 acres of carrots, I will buy those 5 carrots at this price. And we have to do more stuff like that, just like those of us who do consulting tend not to do the work unless someone gives us a contract and says, I'm going to do this much work for this much money. But also farmers have other difficulties. They may have, some farmers I know have had trouble because they can't find an accountant in their community who knows farming because they're trained in a different style of accounting. Often it's very hard to get the right equipment in your community because there are so few small farms really addressing local food production, and you can't get the right tractors or the great inputs. A lot of communities don't support organic production very effectively, and that's been very hard won over the last 40 years. So it's a number of obstacles, and every place has their own little quirks, but there are also people doing wonderful work to overcome those obstacles everywhere as well.
Fantastic. You mentioned some successes and challenges, like you'll go into these communities and you'll see what's doing well, what's not doing well. Over the length of your career, have you noticed a general trend? Like, are there strengths that are changing throughout time, or has there's always been like one point that's always a strength? I don't know if that makes sense, like tech-wise or something.
Well, I mean, I think, when I started learning about organics, it's almost 50 years ago now, I guess about 48 years ago, it was almost difficult to talk about the word organic. It was something that, was a swear word to some people, and people said, you can't possibly grow food organically. And now we know you can, and we know you can grow very good food, and it's very high quality, and it's more or less accepted that that's true. Just like it was very difficult for a gay or lesbian farm couple to be farming in those days because of the culture around farming. And now that's really quite accepted in most communities. So in some ways, those things are much easier to do. I can count on a network of cooperative grocery stores in Minnesota. We have 10% of the co-op groceries in the US are in Minnesota alone. And that gives us, those of us who want to grow food for our neighbors, a tremendous access to the market that we had to build from scratch that we didn't have in 1972. I think the other hand, we have more people talking about local food now, and more people talking about wanting to know their farmer. We have much more federal money coming down the pipeline to support this kind of innovation, but also some of that, some of the money we're getting now isn't really well targeted to building community food systems. It's more to solve a bureaucratic issue or to solve a kind of policy question. And it doesn't necessarily result in concerted work at the community level to really build these systems of support for farmers and eaters and low-income people, and to really make sure that network is very inclusive. I think the other thing, though, we have much more, we're much more aware of now is that 50 years ago, I think people thought we could just sort of change things very rapidly. And now we understand some of the stuff we started 50 years ago is still only getting popular and getting well rooted today. And I think people have a very strong sense now. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to remind us that this isn't going to happen overnight. It's long-term work. You have to count on the system pushing back and frustrating what you're trying to do. And we have to really view this as a long-term commitment to making things change in a very systemic and drastic way. And that won't be easy. And we won't have quick results. It's not a matter of simply having 4 or 5 cool businesses that serve us and allow us to buy beer from a local farmer or to buy cheese that's really high quality. It's really a matter of building a whole system of relationships that lasts over time. And that's a very difficult thing it's actually even hard to write about. It's hard to get media coverage of a whole system because it takes time to study that and understand it. And that's why I think my reports from around the country, which are all posted on our website, crcworks.org, each of them has a pretty good systems view of what are the people in the food system we're trying to change it saying about what's working and what's not working. And I think having that level of understanding is very hard for people to take the time to do. It's very hard to get people to read a book right now or to even read a report. And we tend to kind of be acting more out of our intuition, which is good to have. But also we need to kind of have that long-term view and that real commitment to saying, even though when it gets difficult, we're going to find a way to stick together and push through to make it happen.
Absolutely. So there's a question in the chat about the Ukraine, and I'm glad that someone's bringing this up because we could probably talk a lot about that. Do you think that the Ukraine war impact on petroleum imports - restricting the availability of conventional fertilizers will lead to increased use of compost?
Well, I sure hope it does. The input prices have just gone through the roof. I just heard a good source citing that fertilizer costs have gone up 150% since the war broke out. Farmers were reporting even before the war broke out that their seed prices had more than tripled since the pandemic started. And those costs are going to get really crazy for large-scale farmers who are trying to do things at a very massive scale. And in many ways, small growers and community-based growers have an advantage if they have sources of seed and if they're doing organic practices where they can build their own fertility. That's a real advantage when global crises erupt. The other thing would be that, as Europe confronts its dependence on Russian oil and gas, and as we confront the raising costs of oil, we're getting a tremendous, in theory, a boost for local production because people are realizing we can't ship food all across the world or across the country as readily as we've been able to for the last several decades. And, it causes a lot of pinch and pain right now. It's hard for me to go driving someplace I'd like to go because the gas has gotten so expensive. It's hard for farmers to afford the gas for their pickups. At the same time, those higher gas prices and that awareness we have to move to more renewables really will in the long term prove a benefit to those of us who are trying to grow food and build systems that are closer to home. But it's also true that in the short term, we're having massive failures and famines. And, the first shipment left to Odessa yesterday, but we don't know how safe those shipments are going to be. We have the Russians bombing the port area and killing one of the major grain traders in Ukraine. There's looks like we're going to have a lot of upheaval on the way to getting there.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's another question in the chat. Farming at scale developed with government support to bring down costs. Local food tends to have higher prices, and we want to compensate farmers appropriately. How can we reconcile this with food insecurity in our communities?
Well, those are really tough issues. That's a really terrific question, I think. I think first of all, what I'd say is one of the systems we have in place that helps bridge that is the food bank system in this country. And I think a lot of food banks are just starting to understand that they have a real role in creating a better food system, not simply doing short-term relief. The whole food banking system was basically designed to dispose of surplus food that corporate industrial food players had to get rid of, and they needed a tax break for donating to somebody. And the whole system was designed around kind of false purposes, but it did convey some food to low-income people. Now we have food banks like the Good Shepherd Food Bank in Maine that's been buying food from Maine farms for years under their Mainers Feeding Mainers program, buying fresh organic foods. The food banks in the Twin Cities have been doing this for even longer, buying fresh organic food and giving that to low-income people so that the most vulnerable people in our society have access to the highest quality food possible. And those are donations. Those are subject to the whims of people making donations. And that's, we've been lucky during the pandemic that those donations have increased, but the demand is also higher today than it was 2 years ago when the pandemic broke out, because more and more people are finding that they're running short of food and so on. I think that one of the things a food bank can do is to really organize a system so that they're buying as much food and encouraging as many farmers as possible to raise food for local low-income people, hoping that by doing that, they also set up farmers in business to do more food trade locally. Forward contracting, like the Good Shepherd Food Bank, is a good way to do that. I think also there's a kind of level now that we could have philanthropic dollars pay the difference between what a farmer can get by selling their product to a food bank or by selling their product to a cooperative grocery store, or to a neighbor that has limited resources. And philanthropic dollars could say, okay, we'll pay the farmer a better price than they could get off the market to make sure that they have a good livelihood. We'll use philanthropic dollars and public dollars to fill that gap, rather than simply say, well, the market doesn't carry this. The market prices won't bear this for the farmer. We have to find very creative ways like that of filling the gaps that are there and making things much better for farmers, getting the best possible food for low-income people. If we did that if low-income people in every community had access to the food they deserve to have, and that's going to take hundreds of millions of dollars a year, as Feeding America calculates. But if we did that, we'd have much stronger food systems. And to me, that's one of the tests of whether food system work is going well, is whether it's creating a long-term system that guarantees that everybody who needs food will have access to it. And over time, make sure that that food comes from nearby farms as much as possible at a price the farmer can afford.
Food pantries always need shelf-stable milk, and dairy farmers are really being forced into poverty. How can we link up dairy farmers with processing milk and maybe value-added products like yogurt and cheese?
Well, yeah, I mean, yogurt and cheese and milk are somewhat shelf-stable after they're pasteurized, and the milk is somewhat shelf-stable after being pasteurized, and the cheese is a fairly stable form of getting milk. And yogurt has a pretty good shelf life. It's not as long as cheese, but one of the reasons we have cheese is because it takes a product like milk and makes it long-term shelf-stable for people to use over time. There are lots of food banks that are buying cheese, or for one thing, we have commodity cheese going to food banks from the USDA, which is not the kind of cheese that I tend to prefer to eat, but it does help fill some stomachs and it helps get some food to people. There's, I think the answer is to think about it differently, because we have a whole system set up to basically is designed for the interests of very large producers, very large distributors who have a surplus to get that they can funnel to a food bank. We don't have a food system set up so that everybody who needs milk from a local farm can get it. And that's a matter of thinking very differently, and we'll have to rethink some of our federal policies in that way. one of the exciting examples from one of the groups featured in the book, the Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Center, they've started buying commodity tomatoes out of the cans, and they put that into a marinara sauce for spaghetti. That they blend the commodity stuff with tomatoes from local farms, so they create a product that has shelf stability to it, because they boil it down and preserve it. But they've used the commodity tomatoes to back up the fresh tomatoes they can buy from local farms. They have a hybrid product that costs less than buying all that stuff from local farms, but also gives a little income stream to the local farms, and it gets rid of that surplus commodity tomatoes that are there. And I think thinking along those lines, we're just kind of figuring out where are the little places in the system where there's not a real, and there's a gap we can fill with some clever thinking and some good work to do things differently.
So I have a question too. So oftentimes the food that's at the pantries is a lot of the same thing. So you'll see like celery week after week after week. Is there a way to diversify those USDA commodities more that you know of?
Well, I think it's, the USDA commodities are harder to diversify than for a food bank to say, we're going to diversify beyond what the USDA gives us. Because, every food bank I've ever visited has more cranberries than they can handle, because the cranberry producers have a very strong lobby, and they produce a lot of surplus that they give to the food bank system through the USDA commodity program. And there's a lot of cranberries out there that frankly are very hard to use. But if you're getting celery every week in California because the celery is coming fresh every week in California, that's good. But here, where we have a shorter growing season, and in many parts of the country where the growing season is shorter, then foods come in seasonal ways. And if a food bank is really buying according to the season, and if it's getting that food out to its customers the same way my CSA does, and saying, well, we have celery this week, we're going to have eggplant next week, we're going to have tomatoes and corn the week after that, then everybody's eating in accord with the seasons, which is also, I think, a better way for us to eat too.
I agree. Do you have any examples of food banks that have really good policies regarding what they're going to distribute and what not to distribute from a health standpoint?
Well, a lot of food banks have developed sort of a protocol where they have an agreement. I don't have specific names that at the top of my head, but they have developed an understanding that we're going to ship high quality food, and we're going to have healthy meals for people. We're not simply going to convey a box product because it's cheap to get. And I think that level of conversation at the board level, where people say we're going to really be a system of creating health, and we're going to use our resources of food bank to build a better food system, not simply to hand out food to people. That's the kind of commitment that's needed to make, and writing those policies internally for every food bank. And there are certainly model policies that you can draw from. The food banks I highlighted in the book include the Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona, which has done a wonderful work of not only having policies like those, but also asking recipients of their relief to come in and help with the governance of the food bank. So the food bank is much more responsive to their needs over time. And they're leveraging the assets that their recipients have to become better advocates, to be better spokespeople. Some of their advocates, some of the recipients have become business owners, have become elected officials, and they've found paths for people to really rise out of tough situations to a better place. FoodLink in Rochester has done a wonderful job of integrating processing and delivery of food around a network, and a partnership with a grocery chain called Wegmans in New York. And they have taken a very holistic view of how to do a food bank. The Raleigh Food Bank I visited briefly, and they've been one of the pioneers. Oregon Food Bank has been one of the first to go out there and really try to talk about helping farms grow food, helping get fresh food, filling their trucks with food going both ways, so they're bringing food in from the countryside to the central warehouse of this. When the truck comes back from delivering food to their more remote locations, and having a whole set of policy issues to make local food systems more effective. So there's so many ways that conversation can go, but I think too many food bank management teams are really stuck on the idea that all we measure success by is how many pounds of food we take in and how many pounds of food we deliver. And that's a very simple measure, but that doesn't get you to the long-term thinking about really building the food system of the future either.
Absolutely. So we have a variety of problems in my local food system. It actually would be great if you could come out and help us with some of these things. But one thing we're trying to do is start a food policy council. One issue we're having is that the community doesn't seem very engaged or interested in that. How can we better encourage folks in our community to take more of a role in food systems in general, but in this growing food policy council?
Well, to me, as I mentioned in the book, I think it really starts by getting farmers very personally connected to consumers. And I think that's an easier connection to make than starting a food policy council. I think that, what I've seen in food policy councils through the years is they tend to be really some very overworked volunteers who have no budget, or they get a really good budget because the powerful people come together and start a council that really is not meant to make any changes, but it's meant to keep the powerful people safe. And I think some food policy councils have found a sweet spot between those two extremes. But starting with the policy conversation is difficult when you don't have people being loyal to the farmers and consumers saying, I really want to buy food from somebody I know. I'm working with one region now where I'm working with a chef, and I said, what I think the first step needs to be is to really have a bunch of community meals. They've got a chef who loves to cater a meal for the community and say, okay, let's get a long table or even a small table, even 6 people at a table, and get, a Black person and farmer at the same table, get a low income person and a more wealthy person like the foundation staff person or a foundation donor at the same table, just to connect around food from a local farm, to have a good time talking about the food, where it came from. I was in Iowa where a county staff person brought the county commissioners for a meal because he wanted them to pass an organic preference policy at the county level. So he invited them all to the nature center, and he served them food from farms in the area. And these county commissioners, I was watching them for the first 20 minutes, all they talked about was, oh, I know the main person who made that bread, and I know the person who raised that beef. And you had this whole conversation was about building community and about recognizing each other's strengths and assets instead of, oh, here's another policy thing I have to vote on. And I think finding ways to really break down the barriers by bringing people together in very informal ways, to sit down and share meals together, to get them to meet the farmers. Some of the vegetable prescription programs that hospitals are running invite the low-income people who are getting a CSA share to come into the hospital to meet the farmer so they can find out where that food came from. I think those connections are really critical to make, and those can happen with on-farm meals. They can happen by bringing the farmer into a venue like a food bank to meet the people who get the food. It can happen. One of the food banks I worked with in Maine had this wonderful idea. They had the fire chief and the police chief had to bring a crew in once a year to cook a meal and serve the meal for the low-income people who came for a free meal program. So, the fire chief got to bring 6 of his buddies in, her buddies, whoever, and by doing that together, they got to see the people who were getting the relief. It broke down some of the assumptions of us versus them, but it also got the 6 of them to think differently about food and think differently about the pantry than they would if they weren't actively putting themselves into that situation. So I think that there's a lot of creative ways like that, just to make sure that people talk to each other and connect, and then start saying, oh yeah, I'm going to commit to buying from you, and I'm going to join your farm as a CSA, or I'm going to do this thing and this or this to support the farm. And then out of those, if you talk with people openly about what the food system does and doesn't do well, you come up with answers and strategies for making it better. And I think that can go to a food policy council, and that can go to new businesses starting. It can also go to new networks forming, just to really kind of shape a stronger collaboration.
Absolutely. Thank you. How did you get into this field? And field is a great pun, so we can use it both ways.
I didn't hear that last comment about field.
Oh, I said that's a great pun considering we're talking about food and farms.
Oh, I see. Okay, great. Okay.
How did you get into this field?
Yeah. The sounds a little bit hard on my end, but
Right.
it's actually a very random path. I guess you could say it's an organic path in that way, that it was not something I really planned at all. But it partly comes out of the fact that my father was born on a farm a long time ago in Nebraska and did everything he could to get away from agriculture because he thought it was such a bad way to make a living. But then he also missed his home village, as he missed the people he grew up with. And that created a kind of mystery for me that I wanted to unpack. And many years later, I was a journalist in Minnesota and discovered that I was writing about farming, and I had almost no background in agriculture. So I started learning about farming as part of my journalistic work. And I interviewed a bunch of farmers, and one group of them invited me to come work on their farms, which is where I got to know what they do day to day. I got to know their stories about how the economy worked and didn't work. And it turned out they told me stories about the farm economy that are the core of everything I've done ever since. And it was stories that were borne out by USDA data that no one had ever bothered analyzing. And that really got me started in thinking, well, there's a story here that needs to be told because it's true. It matches the experience with these farmers. And that was, again, a community of farmers who were very good at collaborating with each other. But by listening to them, by kind of taking seriously their stories and trying to do some research to either verify or disprove what they said, it got me into having some very unique stories to tell and some very unique research that no one else had thought to do. And after that, it's a matter of being bullheaded and persisting when things got rough, and having to stop for a while because people didn't get it. And some people just thought I was crazy and didn't see a use for it. But every time we have a credit crunch or a crisis in agriculture, people come back to this work, to my work and to my analysis, and say, we need to bring you into our thinking. So it's, I think it's kind of an extended process for me of going with big ears into a community. I started out with a beard. The farmer people had no idea what to do with me. It was like urban guy with a beard talking about becoming a farmer. They didn't get it at all, but they welcomed me. They took me in. They showed me their farms. They allowed me to work with their animals. They allowed me to hear their stories. And I think what I've done most uniquely in my work is to really take firsthand stories I could from people in the field and to think about them carefully, not to say, oh, someone said something brilliant, but to really think below the surface and then come up with theoretical insights that teach us about the broader systems at work that are portrayed in the stories those farmers tell, or those consumers tell, or those hospital workers tell. And to really develop theory out of very close observation and engagement with people at the community level, and then sharing that with others to see how we broaden that view over time in lots and lots of other places.
Awesome, thank you. How do we convince consumers to actually take the step of buying locally? While we saw an increase in farmers markets and CSA sales in our region as an early reaction to the pandemic, that energy has slowed greatly.
It's very hard. Unfortunately, the big motivator is always fear, and that works in a pandemic when people are, I remember being very fearful that I wouldn't be able to get fresh vegetables in 2020. And now I don't feel as afraid of that. And it does make me more relaxed about my choices and saying, well, some things are easier than what I'm doing. Can I do those now? But I think that we have so many crises right now between the political polarization, which in itself is a reason to sit down and work together to build food systems that cut across party lines. Climate change is becoming much more real to us as we see the fires breaking out around the world. We see the heat and the drought we've been experiencing globally. And I have to unfortunately hope that the level of fear or the level of crisis will make people sit down and say, yes, we really have to think about this differently. And I am seeing some signs where some people who didn't want to talk about this 10 years ago are now starting to make plans for how to build a better food system for themselves. And it's very difficult because we're, the more stressed we are by the economy, the more we think we have to cut corners so we can pay the bills or pay the big charge for our gas bill or whatever. But yet I think it really does boil down to building a sense of trust with each other, building a sense of community, and building a real sense that I want to dwell in a place and I want my grandchildren to dwell in this place for the long haul. And we need to build effective systems to make sure that's possible for all of us. But that's that can be a difficult message to get across.
Absolutely. And I just want to read this comment in the chat too, in case there's any additional things to add. Education on food prep and storage from a perspective of the audience, such as low-income community members. If a person has a limited budget, it can be perceived that they cannot prepare certain foods. If a community member is struggling on feeding their family and juggling their other bills, they might not have the creative energy to think outside the box.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, two stories that I didn't make the book, mostly because of space concerns, but one is a food pantry. Actually, not, it's more than a food pantry, but it's an effort in Maine. Another one in Shreveport, Louisiana, where people are just taking a very holistic approach to poverty. And I think the main one is probably the most rigorous, but it's an effort of saying, okay, we don't hand out food to people. We have a community meal once a month so people can come in and get to know each other. And they really want to bring people into a place to celebrate together, to get acquainted, to cut some deals, to commiserate or whatever people feel like they want to do. But in the course of people coming in for that monthly meal, the staff gets to know the folks who came in, and they basically ask them questions like, what's your situation at home? What's going on? How many family members do you have? What's happening? And what they find is, okay, someone doesn't have pots or pans. And they said, well, it's pretty easy to buy them a pot or pan and get them into that kitchen, but then they didn't have time to cook. So we then started having cooking classes where people could come together on let's say a Sunday afternoon, and they could work in our kitchen, 4 or 5 cooks coming together from different families and cooking meals together that they could take home in plastic containers and feed their family for the whole week. So it became a matter of bringing people in to share an experience of cooking and to enjoy each other, and also have healthy meals that were constructed with a little bit of wisdom about how to do that. And then you had, okay, someone can't come in to cook one week because their kid went to jail. So they have to embrace that situation and say, okay, how do we get bail money? How do we support this family that's got a different kind of trauma? Or maybe there's someone's having stressed out on drugs, so they have to embrace that trauma. And they just basically set aside time and staff and care so that the multiple traumas that low-income people face can be coped with one by one, starting with bringing people in the door with food, but also expanding that into, okay, we care about you as people. You're not simply a statistic that we mark off to our funders. You're someone who's we're in community with, and we're going to walk with you whatever crisis comes up, and we're going to do that year after year, as long as it takes, until these crises start going away. And I think it really requires that kind of support structure to turn this around. And very few people are dedicated enough or find the resources or the vision to really make that work as well as it needs to do. But anyway, that kind of work will be crucial to tackle.
Thank you. Do you envision local food systems being financially self-supporting and sustainable at some point? What will it take?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is the multinational global food system we have with the commodity system is not financially self-sustaining. And it does create wealth for people, and it is very highly subsidized, so that, farmers got about $45 billion of subsidies in the pandemic year because so much money was put into the farm economy, and that had the effect of raising the prices of inputs so that it became more expensive to farm than it had been before. And I think that the main thing I would say is the food system we have does not pay for itself. It's really riddled with subsidies, tax breaks, with all kinds of special breaks. Some cases just inherited wealth that mean people can keep doing things because their grandfather made money farming 100 years ago, not because the system is paying for its way right now. And I think a lot of wealthier farmers are confronting that fact right now. If we have community-based food systems that pay for themselves in the future, it's because we set policy that makes that happen. And I talk in the book about the 3 pillars of policy, which we've known in the farm movement, at least I've known about them since the mid-70s, which is you have to manage the supply. You have to not plant more than your local population can eat or you can store for later use. You have to also have credit available on favorable terms so that people can farm without going into massive debt or losing their farm by not being able to pay it off. And you also have to have, the third pillar I'm blanking out on, but it's a matter basically of public policy, of just saying we have to create the system where farmers can count on a good income. The policy regime creates those efficiencies. We have the infrastructure. Well, we have the, if we grow enough root crops for the whole community, we have a place to store those root crops. If we have enough milk for the whole community, we basically make sure the farmers are producing enough fresh milk on a timely basis that it can go to the schools and go to the food banks and go to people's homes on, while everything is fresh. And we know how to do this, but it's easier to do in a grain system where you have shelf-stable grain products. It's much harder to do when you have perishable milk items and perishable vegetables. But we know how to do it. Those lessons keep getting ignored by policymakers. And then, it's inefficient to sell food locally in many ways now, because the infrastructure we've invested in is really about shipping food long distances. I was traveling through the artichoke fields in central coast of California about 10 years ago. There's a report on the radio telling me that it was cheaper to import artichokes from Paraguay than to buy them from the farms I was driving past. This is 10 years ago in California, that has beautiful artichoke production. But we just create this crazy system where the economics, given the inequalities of income, wealth, land costs, labor costs, mean that it's cheaper to ship foods long distances in many cases than to really have it local. So we have to have a whole system that does that effectively and does that efficiently. And that's going to be public policy, public investment, private investment, and very strong coordination and building lots and lots of trust to work through difficult times.
Absolutely. All right. Any other questions? Would someone like to unmute? I've got a few up my sleeves. One of which is, you write all these books, but do you have a book recommendation for us to learn more?
Well, I mean, I certainly recommend Building Community Food Webs heartily. And I think, what I say about that is that I'm getting some groups that are starting to read it together because, maybe there's a food policy council that's not sure what their strategy should be. Or there's a board of directors. I'm working with one board of directors that wants to do more to address poverty. And I said, and they bought a copy of the book for everybody in the board. So the board could sit down and read that book together, talk about it together, and kind of comment and say, well, this part doesn't apply to us and this part does apply to us, but really thinking that through in a very careful way. And I tried to write the book so it's very accessible. I think it's mostly storytelling. It's mostly a matter of saying, here's what worked in one place. And I'm drawing a few themes and lessons out of that, but I'm pretty much saying, if you listen to stories from Arizona, or if you listen to stories from Montana, you can invent very good answers given what you know about your own place. The situation in Montana is very similar to what we have now, where we had a farm credit crisis going in the middle of some incredibly creative work that Montana folks put together for themselves in the 1980s. And that's a real model to me of how you can think creatively in a crisis period. I don't know, most of the books that I like outside of this one, I think are, obviously Michael Pollan's book has been very interesting, but he does not cover the economics that I cover. My favorite book of my life really is a book called Pig Earth by John Berger, who was an English writer, an art critic. He's passed away now, but he wrote a wonderful book about the traditional culture in peasant country in rural France. Pig Earth, yes. And it's this very evocative stories. It tells a story about these people who've lived together for generations, who have to be very careful what they say, because everything they say might be misinterpreted or might bring back echoes of something that happened hundreds of years ago, and how they confront modernity and how they confront a set of kind of rationalized policies and police and kind of rules that really don't fit their way of life. And I think that's really, to me, a tremendous book about how people can be rooted in place and be very, very clever and have a strong tradition, but also negotiate in their own way with a system that's trying to modernize. And to me, it's always a good caution about not taking our industrialization or technological progress too seriously.
Absolutely. All right. So final question. If you had a magic wand and you could change anything about the food system, what would it be and why?
Oh, that's a great question that we tend to ask all of our people. I think what I would say right now is I think people need to think critically about what they really need out of their lives and their food system, to say there's more to this than just how much money it costs to buy food. I have to be engaged in building a new food system in some way. That can be everything. There's a guy who was a West African who joined a farm in Iowa because someone subsidized a CSA share for him. And after getting a CSA share, he started working on the farm, and he got to know the family so well, he became another family member to this farm couple. And after about a year or two of that, he called him up one day and said, you know, I need to have a party. Can I throw a party on your farm so I can roast a pig? And, or maybe it was a goat, I'm not sure, but it was some small animal. And I think that kind of community building is pretty something that anybody of any income level can do. And it was a subsidized process, but it was also a process where people put real creativity together because they trusted each other and wanted to work personally. Where I now see people thinking more about, how do I write the next proposal? How do I find the best technology? How do I ramp up scale to get, to do even more of what I'm doing, rather than saying, how do we work together to build a community together? And I think that, that would be the thing that I would want people to do more of. I'm finding people, even when they have more money, they're more busy and more stressed, and in some ways thinking in more short-term ways because they have more demands on their time than we had when we were first getting started.
I love that answer. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really interesting. I loved the book. Everyone feel free and check it out. It's called Building Community Food Webs. And thank you again so much for attending, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you all for being here too. I appreciated the conversation.
Have a good one, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.